Sorry, as usual, we have problems with our film, but we are here and we are very happy that you are with us during the long weekend. Let's switch into Polish. Szanowni Państwo, jesteśmy niezmiernie zadowoleni, przepraszam, to mój kot, to się zdarza oczywiście w takich sytuacjach. Jesteśmy niezmiernie szczęśliwi, że dołączyliście do nas podczas długiego weekendu, że zostawiliście grille, pewnie wzięliście ze sobą piwo i siedzicie teraz przed monitorami, oglądacie wielkiego profesora, właściwie dwóch wielkich profesorów, jednego ze Stanów Zjednoczonych, drugiego z Polski, z dwóch wielkich uczelni. Ja naprawdę się z tego powodu bardzo cieszę. Mam nadzieję, że zadamy profesorowi Ducie wiele ciekawych pytań. Ja mam jedno w zanadrzu. Mam nadzieję, że i Państwo będą je notować. Paweł, powiedz, co w najbliższych spotkaniach nas czeka na kolejnych.
Najpierw jeszcze raz po Tobie powtórzę, że jestem naprawdę pod wielkim wrażeniem, że udaje nam się naszymi webinarami oderwać od naszych słuchaczy, od tych przyjemniejszych, wydawałoby się, czynności, od różnych grilli i no to jest sobotni wieczór, a mimo to jestem pełen uznania, że są oni z nami. Co za tydzień? Za tydzień właśnie mamy przerwę w środę, a za tydzień spotykamy się z profesorem Witkiem Watchwą. To jest bardzo uznany również profesor ze Stanów Zjednoczonych, który zajmuje się nowoczesnymi technologiami, więc na pewno będzie również bardzo ciekawy wieczór.
Super. Okay, so let's switch into English and I would like to invite Professor Grzegorz Mazurek from I think one of the best Polish business universities. Probably the best, okay?
Let's have another webinar on that some time ago.
Okay, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bartosz, thank you, Paweł. Guys, it's really great pleasure for me to be with you, but obviously my role is very limited because we have a tremendous guest, Professor Soumitra Dutta. I said just 5 minutes ago that probably the next 20 minutes I'll spend on presenting our fabulous guest. He said that it's quite impossible. I should spend not 20 minutes, only a couple of them, but I need those couple of minutes because this is really fantastic, marvelous person. I would call him, sorry if this is the right saying, but I think it is a Renaissance man, because this is a man who achieved outstanding achievements in academia, in management and business. Just to mention a couple of them. First of all, he was the creator. He's a former dean of S.C. Johnson College of Business of Cornell University. He was associated before also with INSEAD, fabulous business school from Europe. He is associated also with one of the most important organizations creating the landscape of business schools, which is WCSB. The organization which grants accreditations to business schools. In Poland, we have only 2 business schools with such rights, with such badge. Then something very important, I would say the most important, taking into account our today's meeting, and that is that Professor Dutta, he's a co-editor and author of the Global Information Technology Report published by the World Economic Forum. And he is also the creator of Global Innovation Index, the index which is published by the World Intellectual Property Organization. So in fact, our today meeting is about the formal topic is innovating for the post-COVID world, the lessons from the Global Innovation Index. But I'm quite sure that during the speech of Professor Dutta and during his presentation of his thoughts, we'll have a lot of questions concerning the innovation world, the innovations of nations, the solutions for COVID. But probably, at least from my side, I'll have a couple of questions concerning the future of education and the future of business schools. So to be as short as concise, it's a great honor for me to be with you, and I hope that the next I'm absolutely positive the next minutes will be very inspiring for us. So Professor Dutta, the floor is yours. Please use the next minutes effectively.
Well, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you watching from outside Europe. And thank you very much, Rector-elect Mazurek, for your very kind words of introduction. Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, Bartosz, for inviting me to join this webinar. And I'd like to begin by, of course, thanking you for inviting me, but also wishing that all of our viewers and all of our distinguished sort of group members on this screen, your families are all safe and healthy in the midst of this pandemic, which is really affecting many of us in different ways. This is really an unusual time. And whenever I speak to people about the kind of world we're living through right now, everyone says this is once in a lifetime. You know, this happens typically once every several decades. And I don't know if it's good or bad, but in some sense, we are living through a very, very interesting, important moment in history. I will talk a little bit about my research and innovation, but before that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what is happening to us today in the world around us. One of the organizations that I'm involved in is called the Global Business School Network. It's an association of about 110 business schools from around the world. And this is something that came out of the World Bank. The World Bank created about 20 years ago. And right now, we are engaged in a project to understand what will the world look like in the future. And the reason is because business school leaders and business leaders are grappling with this question of what will the world look like after COVID. And as part of the research, we have been interviewing business school deans and business leaders, CEOs of organizations around the world. And I just wanted to share with you 2 or 3 highlights in terms of what messages are we hearing from these interviews. So usually we begin the interview by asking the interviewee, do you think that this is a global tipping point? Do you think that this reflects a point which will represent a dramatic shift in the way in which things are done in the world? And I can tell you that we have conducted around 30 interviews so far of leaders around the world, and every single one of them has said unanimously that this is a global tipping point. So they do expect things will change quite significantly. Of course, not all changes are new. You know, some changes were happening and they got accelerated by the pandemic situation. But there are also a lot of new things that are happening which are interesting in multiple ways. So we ask people also, okay, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think are the most important in your view? So I'm of course simplifying out here for the sake of brevity. I'm happy to go into more depth in the Q&A session as required. But one of the points which has come up repeatedly is that the way business is organized, the way business is structured, the way business leaders look at their goals is going to shift. And the shift is not just in terms of, you know, supply chain resilience and trying to have more redundancy in supply chains or the China plus one philosophy in supply chain management, but it's more fundamentally about how do you balance this focus on efficiency, on economic growth, on productivity, which has been the dominant philosophy in business, with now an increasing awareness that people, humanity, human values, and people issues are extremely important. Today, a lot of CEOs and a lot of business leaders realize that the well-being of the employees is of critical importance. And what is interesting is that even in society today, if you look at the so-called essential workers that have have been very important in helping us overcome the pandemic in all countries. You know, they are the people who man the retail outlets. They are the people who drive trucks, who drive ambulances. They are the people who are nurses and, of course, doctors. And a variety of other people who are deemed as essential workers for society, for enabling us to live our lives. But in general, most of them are not the highest paid workers. So, you know, it's interesting in a way that how come we don't value the efforts of those who are so important for us in society. So it's raising a whole set of questions around productivity, economic force, you know, and other kinds of economic measures, and the human values and people well-being, and how we recognize and value human work. The second thing which has come up in many discussions has been this rise of digital or digitalization of businesses. And clearly, you know, no one ever thought that we would all in universities and business schools and companies be suddenly moved to an online remote working environment. But guess what? It has happened. And in fact, what is interesting is that by and large, not for everyone, of course, but by and large, for those whose work could be done remotely, the transition has been relatively smooth. You know, I'm sure Rector Mazurek will confirm it, but I know from my experience at Cornell University, even professors who were reluctant to try digital online learning, they have moved a lot of the teaching online quite successfully. And I think the same is true for many other organizations. In fact, some people argue and say that, well, look, the productivity of many organizations, in fact, has not gone down because of remote working. In fact, in many cases, it has gone up. And many of us find ourselves very busy doing webinars and having Zoom meetings and other kinds of televideo sessions all through the day. And because travel is less, suddenly people realize that, in fact, their quality of life has improved in many ways. So there's a whole questioning right now in terms of, is there a need for office space? How do you actually manage employee workforce remotely? And how much of it needs to be done remotely and how much of it together? And there's a whole question in terms of even how you organize physical meetings together for company employees in the future. So I think what we will see is that we are seeing the acceleration of digitalization, and a lot of things are going to change in education and in private sector businesses or even governments in the future. The third point, and this is the last point from those interviews that I'll mention to you, is the sudden sort of realization of human values, not just in professional lives, but more so in our personal lives. You know, what I have heard, and I'm sure it's true for many of us, certainly it's true for me, is that in the last 3.5 months, you know, I was compelled to spend all the time with my wife at home. Both of us are working and we both were very busy, but we were there 24/7 for 3 months together. And this is something which was quite a unique experience because, you know, both of us, like many couples, have professional lives, we have meetings, we travel, and so on. And suddenly, in some sense, it gave a chance for us to rediscover each other. And I hear that from many of the interviews. People said, well, look, you know, I had not spent so much time with my children, so much time with my family for so much time, for so many years. And suddenly I discovered that the people closest to me, who are also the most important for me, in different ways. I discovered aspects of what they mean to me, what kind of a difference I mean to them, and a variety of other human values. And I think you saw that return to humanity also happen in countries like Spain or Italy and others, where in confinement, people were supporting each other. People were trying to have games and singing across balconies and so on. So there was, and there has been a return to some humanity. I certainly hope that, you know, some of these values stay with us. And in particular, they help us to look at the world in a slightly different lens, maybe a lens that is more humane, a lens that is more gentle on the environment, in which we collectively realize that we have to, be more sustainable in our practices. And so I think, these are the 2 or 3 messages that came across very strongly. And of course, what it means out here is that we will see a lot of changes in the way people conduct themselves, in the way businesses conduct themselves in the future. And this brings us to the notion of innovation, the whole topic of innovation. I do not think that despite all the challenges that right now many companies face in terms of financial cash flows, or many governments face in terms of other fiscal deficits and other kinds of challenges, innovation is going to slow down. Now, as was mentioned earlier, one of my studies is the Global Innovation Index. I created this about 13 years ago, and around 8 years ago, the United Nations adopted this as the standard of innovation for the UN. And today, the Global Innovation Index is published by the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the UN organization focused on patents in Geneva. And for those of you who are interested, you can go and look at Global Innovation Index, one word, .org. So globalinnovationindex.org, and you can find all the information. Now, based on this innovation index research, which really is the most comprehensive assessment of innovation in countries for the last 15 years or last 13 years, we can identify some interesting results or trends, which I think are interesting. So one trend which is very important and interesting is that historically we found that the level of investments in innovation typically was, let's say, comparable to or roughly paralleled the growth in GDP. And when the growth in GDP decreased or shrank, the investment in R&D and other kinds of innovation decreased. But since 2008, so this is the last crisis we faced, 2008, 2009, we have seen a divergence between the GDP growth rates and the investment rates in innovation. So what we have seen is very interesting. In the last 10 years, the innovation investment rates have actually been growing faster than the GDP growth rates. And in fact, what is also interesting is that in many countries, the amount of money invested in innovation did not really decrease because of the financial crisis. And there's a reason for this. The reason for this is that even though governments in many countries decreased the level of expenditure on R&D and innovation, private sector stepped in, and private sector actually increased the level of innovation in investment and R&D. And so what has happened really is the total investment, public and private sector investment, innovation and R&D has actually gone up in the last 10 years, despite the crisis that we faced in 2008, 2009. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not, as a result of this current crisis, the innovation rate suffers or the innovation rate, in fact, keeps on going up. From all that we can actually see, the initial signs are that innovation rates will keep on increasing, mainly because, once again, the private sector is stepping in. Because what is true is that private sector sees many new opportunities. Technology is a key driver, opening up new opportunities. And certainly people expect, and that's one reason why the stock prices of companies that are more technologically, digitally invested have gone up in recent years, is because people expect much more innovation and much more new things coming from these tech-savvy companies, not just Microsofts and Googles, but also any company that has a very digital, strong component to its business portfolio. So one is the element of investment rates. The second thing, which is interesting, of course, is innovation. So innovation is very dependent on entrepreneurship. And what we have seen is there has been a decline in VC money, venture capital money for entrepreneurs in the first quarter of this year. Now, what is true is that the amount of VC money being invested for entrepreneurship has been declining for a few years. So it's not a new decline, but what we have seen is there has been a more rapid decline in the last few months. Now, why was the amount of VC investments available, the VC deals actually decreasing in the last few years? A lot of it has to do with the structural changes in the whole VC industry as large and the notion of winners taking all in the current global markets. So if you look at, for example, SoftBank and SoftBank's strategy of coming and making this mega investments in a few projects, and the belief that these few big projects would in fact dominate the spaces, whether it's Uber in mobility or other kinds of unicorns in specific spaces. So there has been a tendency of fewer entrepreneurship VC-backed deals, even though the amounts going to the winners have increased as a whole. So this trend actually has accentuated, and this has resulted in the number of VC deals being smaller in the first quarter. Now, it remains to be seen how this evolves in the future, but I certainly hope that the amount of VC deals will in fact pick up, and the money will be more evenly spread. And this is also because in recent months, we have seen some fairly spectacular failures of some of the unicorns, like, for example, WeWork, or like, for example, the struggles of companies like Uber and Lyft. So I think people are questioning whether or not that winner takes all unicorn kind of model of entrepreneurship is in fact the right one. And hopefully there will be a shift towards a more broad-based, let's say, support of entrepreneurship going forward worldwide. So I certainly hope that entrepreneurs around the world will get supported as they look at innovation funding, because funding is very key important. If you look at surveys of entrepreneurs right now, one of the key challenges that entrepreneurs face is funding. And many entrepreneurs have seen their revenues dry up because the customers are either not buying or unable to buy as much as before. And they've had to, in fact, lay off their employees. On average, about 15-20% employees have been laid off in many entrepreneurial startups. So I think what we need at this moment is special support from the government, from various key organizations in the VC industry to support entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, because if we do not do so, we will in fact probably kill off innovation, and that will not be a good thing for everyone in the future. One more point that I would like to make about innovation and the Global Innovation Index is that every year we study around 126 or 129 countries, a little less than 130 countries. And over 13 years, we have been able to, let's say, observe some trends in terms of what makes things better or worse for organizations. Now, the different ways of cutting the data and analyzing the data, and we have had the good luck and the privilege of being able to analyze the data in multiple ways because we have a fairly rich data set available to us. What are some key insights that we find? So one we find is that if you look at countries that do well innovation, all of them tend to have a very strong national policy on innovation. So a national policy innovation requires the government to in fact coordinate multiple aspects required for supporting innovation. This requires a coordination across funding, education, policies for startups and other kinds of tax regulations, investments in R&D. A whole set of things have to come together to support innovation. So you need some kind of a national policy or national leadership on that. And this is something you see happening in Europe. You see it happening in let's say, Asian countries, and even in America right now. I don't know whether you know this, but in the Congress, there's a very important act, which is an act that has been proposed right now to increase investments in R&D in the US by $500 billion for the next 10 years. And this is really designed to counter some of the competitive threats that America is facing from China. And this is really, in some sense, aimed at coordinating better the various innovation agencies and innovation efforts across the US. So there's a necessity that many countries feel that we have to coordinate better, because many countries are doing many things. But if you look at, for example, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the technology frontiers, you have to be able to bring resources together to be able to compete effectively. Look at what, for example, China has done in some key areas, like, for example, high-speed trains or other areas like solar technologies. They have really coordinated different technology sources or companies to create that kind of competence. So the first thing that we find is a national policy leadership is critical. Second, if you look at different income groups, you see different things. So if you look at the high income countries, so let's say typically European countries or the Western countries, OECD countries, and you ask the question, what separates the better performers from the lower performers among the high income countries? Typically, high income countries have, on general, good education, good regulations, and a good infrastructure. A lot of the base is already present in the high income countries. So what we find from our research is the key differentiator between the countries that perform better than others in the high income group is their digital focus. The countries that have adopted digital technologies more intensively, whose corporations are doing more in digital areas, those are the countries that typically do better. Because usually today, almost everything has become digital in nature, because in some sense, biology is digital, physical manufacturing is becoming digital with 3D manufacturing, and of course, all information is digital by nature. So this culmination of the physical with the biological, with the digital, really means that everything today essentially is becoming digitized. And the countries that are focusing more on digitalization are the ones that will in fact do better. Now, in this context, I think given that I'm speaking now from Spain and most of the audience probably is in Poland and in Europe, what is interesting to keep in mind is that Europe does not today have true digital leaders of the same scale as what US and China has. If you look today at the top 20 digital leaders in the world, about half of them are from the US and half of them are from China. And none of them are from Europe. And that is an issue, because I think you look at Europe's future competitiveness, we do not necessarily have true digital leaders of global scale and size coming from Europe. Yes, we have Spotify, we have a few success stories, but not of the same scale and size as Apple, Facebook, and and Tencent and Alibaba and other kinds of similar giants from US and China. So I think digitalization, digital leadership is very critical. If you look at the low income countries and you actually ask the question, what separates the ones that do better than the others? What we find is that it is really the focus on creating a stable and a transparent and a healthy business environment. This includes regulation, this includes market access, this includes other kinds of sort of non-business but environmental variables that actually affect how business operates. So the better you are in being able to create the environment for business, to be able to support business, to do the right things, the more successful you are in terms of innovation and your wealth creation. So creating the right environment, which today in many developed economies we take for granted, having a good judicial system, a good legal system, a good IP laws, we take these things for granted. But in many poor or low-income economies, these things are not often present. So if you can actually make these things more widely available in these low-income economies, these low-income economies can in fact do better and in fact make progress. So at low-income economies, the business environment broadly defined is the critical factor that makes a difference. Now, if you look at middle-income economies, what becomes very important is the level of business sort of sophistication. When I use the word sophistication, I mean to represent a range of features of how the business is capable of absorbing knowledge and of transforming the knowledge into effective products and services for the customer. So really it is the quality of businesses, both large and small, that differentiate which middle income economies are able to do better than others. So at the middle income group, it's recommended that countries focus very heavily on building business capabilities, which could imply investing in business schools, investing in education, investing in policies to support R&D investments by businesses, encouraging business to in fact go global, because when you go global, you're forced to compete in global markets, and a variety of other things to improve the quality of business and the sophistication of businesses in the country. So let me sort of just conclude with a couple of thoughts about some of the challenges around innovation that we are seeing today. I began with a discussion of challenges linked to the pandemic, and maybe I'll close with some challenges linked to the current geopolitical situation we are seeing and facing, in light of what is happening in the US, China, and Europe in the middle. I think all of us are very aware that there is a pretty open strategy adopted by the US administration to contain, in some sense, China's technological progress. And this is something which has become a very high, let's say, element of concern, because people see that the countries that will lead in the future are the ones that will dominate the technology frontier. And today, for example, AI and quantum computing are seen as the technology frontier, and people both in the US and in China are trying very hard to be there at the frontier. So there is a notion that countries have to be technologically extremely sophisticated and at the leading edge to lead. And of course, China is the biggest, let's say, competitor to the current #1 leading position of the US. So there is a very strong movement inside the US to contain China, especially in the view of technology. Now, I think this is very dangerous for technology and innovation in general. So if you look at innovation, innovation thrives on an open environment. So part of the research what we find in the Global Innovation Index is that the countries that are the most innovative, they are the ones that absorb new ideas from others, essentially pay money to others for buying the ideas, royalties for licenses. And they are the ones that create the most new ideas and essentially sell it to other countries. So they also earn the highest royalties for new ideas and for their own IP. So this give and take, this exchange, I get ideas, I combine, I create new ideas, and I sell it to others, is the inherent nature of how innovation works. Now, if you find policies that in fact create some kind of a disjointment or some kind of a division in how knowledge flows or how technology collaboration takes place, and if somehow you create this US space and a Chinese space that do not really talk to each other very well, ultimately, fundamentally, you're slowing down innovation. And that is a huge challenge. And I don't know what the right solution out here is, besides to say we need to collaborate and do more in a transparent manner, because in America, people often have real concerns about some malpractices of some Chinese companies in the past. This does not mean that China is a bad player today in every aspect. It is not. China has made tremendous progress in many aspects, and I don't know how many of you know this, but since 2017, China exceeds the US in some key innovation metrics, like, for example, the number of researchers, the number of patents, the number of publications. And this is something which has changed a lot in the last few years. In terms of total R&D investments, China is a little bit behind the US, but it is growing at a faster pace. So most people expect that in the next 5 years, Chinese R&D investment will probably equal or increase US R&D investments. So China is making a tremendous progress and is increasing at a tremendously fast pace. And how this affects the world of innovation is going to be very interesting to see. Now, if you're, of course, an organization that's looking at innovation, you have to look at all the global innovation happening worldwide. So you have to look at innovation happening in China, in Brazil, in US, and India, elsewhere, and be able to learn from all of them. And so I think I have some concern about how the world of innovation will evolve if we create barriers out there amongst nations, across nations. I also think these barriers can have issues when you have controls and people movement. As you know, there are moves about trying to control Chinese researchers coming and spending time in American labs, or other kinds of American researchers going and spending time in Chinese organizations. And these kinds of controls are actually quite risky and quite dangerous for the future. And a big interesting question in all of this is, where does Europe stand in all of this? Because Europe clearly has a very important role. As Europe as a whole, of course, including the UK even today, is the biggest economic area in the world. And I think it's an interesting question about how does Europe play its role in innovation? And I think we have to, in Europe, become stronger in basic technology, R&D, and development. We are strong in Europe in many areas of R&D, certainly. But I think on the digital front, we have to become stronger because that is the future. And I think we also have to become stronger in supporting innovation in flexible ways. A good example is this whole GDPR regulation. So GDPR, Europe was very key in terms of promoting it. And I think GDPR has many good aspects, protecting consumer privacy and protecting the law of data sort of secrecy, and is very good. But then what you realize is, for example, a situation like the COVID environment, where for finding the vaccine, you need to have collaboration and sharing of data. You need to be able to do that openly across country borders. Suddenly, people found that GDPR was perhaps limiting the sharing of information across European countries, across European scientists. So I think we have to be a little bit more careful in terms of how we impose regulations, a little bit more mindful of the fact that the digital innovation front is being dominated by US and China, and we have to find in Europe a European solution, a European counterforce, a European leadership. Otherwise, we might risk being left behind in the global race. So let me stop there because I've covered a number of different points. I started with the findings from the COVID, post-COVID world study of business school deans and CEOs. I moved to the lessons from the Global Innovation Index, and I concluded with some comments about what I see happening in terms of the US-China debate on the technology innovation front. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Soumitra. That was amazing. Great hints also for business schools. There are a couple of questions which I noted during your speech, but instead of citing all of them one by one, I'll try to use one common denominator because actually most of those questions, they talk about the same. For example, one question is, why is Poland so low in the ranking? Secondly, what are the hints for Polish government to make the innovation rate higher? Then you mentioned about something very important. You mentioned something about the national policy of developing innovations. And then you move to the situation of China and China against US. One question arises here. Do you mean national policy for developing and facilitating innovations? Or let's put it frankly, do you think about controlling the innovations from the top and centralizing the management of innovations?
No, so I think it's more about policies to support innovation. I don't think anyone advocates control of innovation centrally because that has not been successful. Generally it has failed. The best example was Japan with this whole MITI effort in 1980s and 1990s, and tried to sort of do it centrally and didn't really work out very well. I think what today in Europe, and this is true for many countries in Europe, not just Poland, I think the biggest problem that European entrepreneurs and European companies face is that the European market is still very fragmented. A couple of decades after the creation of the common European market, still the European market is very fragmented. Think about all the differences in languages and local regulations and differences in customs that make it so difficult for a Polish entrepreneur to sell and service clients in France or in Spain. So the thing is so different. And in contrast to, let's say, an entrepreneur in California can easily service and sell products to clients in New York or in some other state. So because the market is so fragmented, companies in Europe find it very hard to scale. So we have a lot of great ideas out here, but because they're unable to scale fast enough, they get bought out very easily by American or Chinese big players. So what you see is that there are a lot of acquisitions of European talent. If you look at, for example, in the case of Google, all the AI technology, a lot of it comes from UK. So UK has given DeepMind and other kinds of AI shops. And so I think what you find is that there is a limitation in scaling up and growing. And in a world where being big actually is beautiful and strong, European companies often have a difficulty in growing big because the key element of becoming big and successful is data. The more data you have, the more successful you can be, because the more you can do an analysis, the more you can do analytics, the more you can personalize and so on. And the big people, the Amazons and Alibabas who have a huge data sources, they are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and they are becoming more and more sophisticated. So it just simply, that's a huge problem for European companies that are saying there is no easy solution unless, we really try and make it easy, which is hard to do because cultural barriers are quite large.
Thank you. One of the questions, one of the things which also is put here is something interesting. For sure, you heard about a very fierce discussion what the real innovations are, and there was a talk about California and Silicon Valley. They create a lot of buzz investments, but in fact, when we have COVID, everybody is helpless, right? So the question is, do we really create innovations by shrinking the world and networking the world, whether perhaps the real innovations are not created, meaning spaceships and getting rid of cancer and other things which are the real problems of humankind. So how do you see that? Do you is it possible somehow to differentiate those innovations?
I don't think so, because I do think, okay, of course, in Silicon Valley, a lot of things have happened which are not necessarily good or not necessarily always useful. But Silicon Valley has also created many wonderful things, and not just chip factories and database companies and other kinds of app companies, but also think of, for example, Tesla. Tesla came from Silicon Valley, out of the outside, the whole traditional car manufacturing centers in Germany or in the US. So I think a lot of disruptive things have come out from Silicon Valley, and that is, the strength of this whole area. But having said this, you mentioned the COVID vaccine. I think we have made a lot of progress in COVID vaccine. Normally, if you look at the previous history of vaccine creation, it took several years, 5 to 10 years. And today, now already, we have several vaccines entering into stage 3 trials. So this has happened in a matter of a few months. So a lot of it is linked to a lot of collaboration, but also a lot of data analysis and techniques. Today, for example, a lot of clinical trials are being done in software simulation simply because it's faster. To do it in physical, traditional ways would be much more expensive and much more longer. So I think even the ways of doing traditional things have changed. And guess what? The companies who are leading those clinical trials in software are American. Why? Because they have the digital expertise to do it. As I was saying, the digital expertise is becoming like the frontier. And the countries and the companies that have more of that will, in fact, be the ones that will lead in different areas of innovation. A lot of innovation in the future will come from being able to access large data sets, being able to manipulate them in intelligent ways, and being able to get new insights from them.
I keep my fingers crossed for that, what you're saying, because I have the impression that the whole world is in wait mode, wait for fall time and, potential second wave of coronavirus. So they have to be quick.
It's hard to say what will happen because, obviously here we have a biological entity, a virus that, it's hard to predict how it'll evolve and how it'll mutate. But if you just look at the rate of progress that has been made from a scientific point of view, in coming together, collecting information, sharing information, coming up with disease treatment protocols and vaccine procedures, it's actually phenomenal. This has happened only in 6 months. In 6 months to go from 0 to a stage 3 trial actually is phenomenal. Now we have to wait and see. It may not work. The virus can mutate. A lot of things can change. But it's good for science. I think all this has shown also sharing is very important when making progress.
We have more or less 10 minutes. So I have one very easy question for you. What do you think the world will look like in 2, 5, or 10 years? What are the most promising technologies? And if you allow me, I would add here how business schools will look like in 5 years.
Yeah, so I think a lot of things will change. And let's just focus on business schools because that's a concrete example, but the same thing can be applied to other organizations too. If I look at, for example, business schools and universities in general, we have been very slow to change. So, in many ways, things have stayed, very, very constant for centuries. And now suddenly suddenly things have moved online, okay? And if I had to sort of simplify the move, I would say the move has been successful, but only partially so. In some sense, we have just taken what we did in the physical classroom and moved it online. We haven't actually had the time to rethink what we do. And obviously, the move has helped some ways, but the learning experience in general hasn't been as good as in the classroom in general. And that's because we haven't had time to rethink the learning experience. A lot of university leaders, and you are a rector of a university, I think are just hoping that COVID goes away, life goes back to normal and we can just go back to the classroom-based teaching, what we were comfortable with. But I think that would be the wrong thing to do. Even if COVID, let's say, goes away, I don't think it's going to go away, but even if it goes away, I think it's a good time to rethink what we have been doing, to question the kind of things we took for granted. Imagine, in France, for example, I'm sure the same thing happened in Poland probably, the French bac, which is the most, sought after, most talked after, high school leaving exam in the country. French bac decides the future of most French students. That wasn't held this year. The international baccalaureate exams wasn't held. I mean, suddenly you question, is there a value in this exam that we're taking for granted? The California state system has said they will not use any scores for the next 2 years. So I think, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's time to start questioning things that we have taken for granted. Do we need to do things a certain way? Do we need 4 years for education? Do we need something else? Is there a different way of looking at education and learning? So my hope is that universities plus businesses in general will use such opportunity to rethink and question what they have been doing and use the digital power to design things for a better future. And the better future can be even simple things like, we know that there's so many millions of students in Africa, in Latin America, who don't have education. And if you can actually educate, I don't know how many students you have in your university, but most universities have 10, 20,000 students. But why 10, 20,000? Why not 200,000? Why not 500,000? Now, I'm not saying this is something that is easy to do, but just posing the question, if there's so many people who need education in the world, and if we have the resources to do so, why can't we serve more people? The same is true for healthcare. You know, so many people need healthcare and we don't have. Telehealth can be a good way to at least provide healthcare to people who don't have anything. You know, telehealth is not good as in-person consultation, but for someone who doesn't have anything, telehealth is better than nothing. So I think what I just hope will do is businesses generally will rethink the future and will move in an aggressive, agile fashion, because we don't change, because now we have the momentum. Now you can change. So if you don't change now, you know, it's very easy to slide back to the sort of safety zone and the comfort zone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is a very nice question about the competences of manager. I quote the question directly. Can you tell us how you imagine an innovative manager of the 21st century? What competences should he or she have?
Yeah, so it's a very important question, as an interesting question, and people have been researching this for, you know, quite some time too. People have looked at people we admire as innovative researchers or innovative managers like Steve Jobs and try to identify and see what are the common characteristics. And one of my colleagues basically said that, you know, you just look at a 4-year-old child. A 4-year-old child in any country typically has some behaviors. A 4-year-old child observes very keenly the environment, questions almost constantly, you know, the parent or whatever, always experiments, even at the risk of hurting himself or herself, never gives up, is perseverant, you know, tries and keeps doing things. And of course, has a network of mentors, or in this case, family and friends, they go to if they have a problem. So if something gets wrong, something is a problem, then they actually go and get help from brother, sister, mother, father, whatever. So if you look at these attributes, observation, questioning, perseverance, experimentation, having a mentorship group, these are the kind of attributes of innovative managers. And these attributes, interestingly, are present in a 4-year-old child. Mm-hmm. So we have to ask the question, what happens, from a 4-year-old child till, they reach our companies, having gone through school and university.
Yeah, Jack Ma last year, I think during the World Economic Forum, he said that we should play instruments and play games and so on. So
yeah, no, there are different ways. I think there are all kinds of different approaches. Yes.
There is one nice question coming from Monika Sonka. She's from, I think Monika is from Kuzminski University. That's why this question is so brilliant. So watch out. As Europeans, what is the element we should definitely unlearn to catch up with China and US?
That's a very hard question, an excellent question, Monica. I think, we have to be able to be bold and make it easier for young people to do interesting new things. I think often today, the young people in Europe don't necessarily have access to the same kind of ambition. And this is simply because, they don't necessarily have that ability to see other role models. I have taught in both Europe and America extensively. And when I look at young people in both countries, what I find is there's a much higher degree of willingness to take risks and to experiment in America as compared to Europe, even though the quality intellectually, I would argue, is often higher in Europe. So often you take Europeans and put them in America, the behavior changes, but intellectually, actually, the quality is extremely high in Europe, but somehow the environment that we have does not encourage them to think big. And I think this is an issue. I think we have to be able to unlearn ourselves to think limited to our national boundaries. I think the Erasmus program that we've had very successful in Europe has been very good at opening up the boundaries for young Europeans. But the more we open up the boundaries, the visions and the limits of what is possible, and the more we'll be able to inspire, because what you need is really inspiration. Because once you're inspired, you will in fact try and create interesting new things. And I always say that innovation happens in two situations, inspiration or desperation. I don't think in Europe we are in desperation mode, usually that's more true in poor countries. So here you need inspiration. So the whole question is, how do you inspire young people and get them to think big?
I absolutely agree. I think that the redefinition of failure in Europe is really needed. Failure in Europe is something we really try to avoid, and which really creates huge tension, whereas actually it may be huge opportunity.
No, in fact, what is interesting is, Jeffrey, allow me, if you read the annual statement of Jeff Bezos for Amazon, he writes an annual statement every year. I think 2 years ago, 1 year ago, he wrote this thing that he looks at, of course, failures in Amazon. But he added a very interesting point. He said he also looks at the scale of failures. He said at Amazon's size, Amazon is a big company, you need big failures. If you don't have big failures, that means you do not take big risks. You see, to move the needle, you need to try big projects. And if you only have small failures, the small failures will not have succeeded to make big changes. So I think it's very interesting to look at the scale issue.
Culture of risk. There is one question coming from Professor Ludwicki from Warsaw, University of Warsaw, who is very much eager to know what is your perspective on accreditations. Are they sustainable? Is COVID going to change the accreditation system in business schools?
I think we should certainly question. I certainly said earlier that we have to use this chance to question everything. If the French back could be stopped, and if many other national sort of sacred sort of things we're taking for granted could be stopped, there's no reason why we shouldn't question accreditation. Just we should not take it as a granted. And I certainly hope that ACSB and EFMD, they take this opportunity to question what is the value and role of this kind of accreditation, or if it should evolve to something else. I think it's a good time to question.
Thank you, Professor. Well, the time is up. There are a couple of additional questions, but I think in most cases they covered that what you said before. Bartosz, you said at the very beginning that you have one particular question for the very end of this discussion.
Of course, I had the question, but somebody asked it. I would like to ask why Poland is so low in global innovation index.
I get it. So I get it. So that is the main reason of this whole fabulous webinar, to convince Professor Dutta to change the parameters to make Poland #1.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right.
All the potential to do well. And I think what I would say is that, you have to go and look at the details of the data. It's all, there's no subjective data in the analysis. It's all objective data, hard data. So you go look at the data to actually analyze which parameters are areas to increase. And I think, if we had more time, we could look at it in more detail. But as an overall thing, what I would say is that Poland has great universities, great human talent, that's for sure. I think what Poland needs to do much more is have a national policy and focus on innovation, focus on technology much more, and leverage the market access it has both in the East and the West. So I think Poland is sitting somewhere in the middle and has the benefits of being able to access markets. So I think you need to be able to access markets both in the East and the West, because markets, customers are very important to be able to succeed and grow companies. Okay,
thank you. Thank you very much. I am absolutely sure that our university, like Korniński, are really, really great. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today's in Poland night. Thank you very much for the presentation or for your speech, and it was very interesting for me. Grzegorz, thank you for being with us. And
my great pleasure. My great pleasure.
I'm really sure that I would like to use you another time in the future, because you were great, absolutely great moderator. But I know that being a moderator of great Professor Dutta is a good thing, and I know I know that everybody was really great. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Soumitra. Thank you, Bartek.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the
See you.
evening.
Bye-bye. Thanks
Bye.
a lot.
Bye. Thanks a lot.